fine morning.
It's an account to keep the same.
Check. Yeah, I think it works. So welcome everyone. It's great to have you here, and also welcome to all of you joining us on the internet. I hope it's now. So welcome. My name. Sorry.
Can you explain what that means?
Yes, absolutely. We'll come to. But first, I say hello. My name is Wolf-Peter Schill. I'm actually with the German Institute for Economic Research. That is the DIW Berlin. And currently, I'm a visiting researcher here in Melbourne, and would like to take the opportunity to say once again, thanks. Thank you very much for having me here. Great. And I'm obviously also part of the Energy Transition Hub. And today I was put in a kind of special situation because I'm the moderator, but also the co-author of this talk, which kind of distorts my incentives a bit, but I'll try to not to abuse it. Today's presenter is Kelvin, standing here is also relatively new to Melbourne. He's at the Energy Transition Hub, but just moved this year from Perth, actually. So Kelvin did his PhD at Curtin University, and before that he had several years of experience in the mining industry doing optimization work there. And his background is in electrical engineering and science. I must say, I really enjoy working with you very, very much. So Kelvin did some brilliant work on solar prosumage or central solar plus battery systems, and what the market uptake will them, or how it developed, and what are the wide implications of that. And we are actually cooperating here. I think we live up to the expectations of the Australian-German Energy Hub, because we brought together models for sides of the world. That is this model on the actual uptake of these solar and battery capacities, and a model we from the German side to then explore all the actual power sector implications. And I think this is really a very good cooperation. And Kelvin will now tell you what we found. I hope that's enough of the context. If you will ask later on, so Kelvin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Wolf. So we have in Australia the situation of lots of rooftop PV. That is well known, well understood. Yet, what are the implications for the rest of the work? What are the implications for if you're a solar farm? What if you're a wind farm? How does that really affect you? And that's just with PV. What happens when batteries come into the mix? Is it too loud? Okay. So what we've done here is we've gone through a process of actually trying to evaluate that and try to figure out positive outcomes that are useful for industry, useful for system managers to go and think about what sectors are actually vulnerable. or different effectively. And that's when you're looking at households, when they put their PV in, when they put their tree in, what's the shape of the network end up looking like. So we have new stories, lots of rooftop PV. We have AEMO being surprised how much PV is being installed. So these things are today. I mean, we need to think about how did this actually, how would not just PV, but then how battery change the game at the household level. So this sort of ongoing piece of work that through my PhD, which has really going to look at the economic incentives and what the drivers are. Where are those 10 points? And then what does that end up meaning? Okay, so first step is, why do people put PV systems? You know, and really comes down to how much they pay for electricity and how they get for the electricity they put out to the net. So blue line, what you usually have in terms of consume a bit more during the morning when everyone wakes up. Everyone goes to work, goes down. When it comes home, they switch the TV on, cook dinner. Ends up being ramp up. So that relays with your solar curve, and you get paid by areas. And then the amount you get paid is really determined by these two factors. So whatever the feed-in tariff is, that's whatever you for your exports, and that gap is actually your self-consumption. So whatever you can consume of your PV system is actually worth this gap. And that gap is what defines sort of how big a system that you want to install. So right now, this is Perth prices is 27 cents for kilowatt hour, get 7 cents feed-in tariff. And when you look at that equation, you just look at that map, you go, the higher this goes really depends on how much you're getting paid for. Would you want to make this too big? Because you only get 7 cents for it. So really, you only get the most amount of this teal color and the least amount of the yellow. So you end up sizing systems which are on the smaller because it works best in your interest. But batteries change this. They actually change the dynamic. They change that equation where these same triggers that you use to measure PV actually flips on you. So the moment you add a battery system, whatever the battery can actually use later, values. So you've changed from 7 cents to 22-cent value, and the battery and the size of the battery, how the PV work together, will determine how much you actually capture out of this. And that happens not one day, but the entire year. So you have to figure out that there's now a relationship between the incentive PV system and the battery system, and they work together the feed-in tariff to actually drive investments in household PVs and batteries. So this whole thing also has to interact with the feed-in tariffability. So in the WA system, if your inverter is greater than 5 kilowatts, you get 0 for anything you export. You have this position where if you go to, you actually might not get anything for it. Over here in the East Coast, there's line and hosting capacity and spec permits. So a similar arrangement exists. Now, where the incentives actually really interesting is when you start with this feed-in tariff, is that's the value of self-consumption is that gap. So if you raise the feed-in tariff to about half the value, then the self-consumption value and the export value are actually the same, which means this would be 14.5 cents, that would be 14.5 cents, and you actually need a battery. If your feed-in tariff is too high, you don't need a battery. But you end up encouraging all these people to put big EV systems in. So Taylor knows this. They can't raise the feed-in tariff, want to, and at the same time, if they drop it to 0, that self-consumption now skyrockets and goes through the roof, and it really incentivizes people to put batteries. So these levers that the retailers have in order to control how much PV people put in, batteries put in, they actually don't really have a recourse forward. They're trapped. And what really sets that balance is the price of PVs and batteries. As those drop, there's this encroaching tipping point. And it's very restrictive in how they can find that. So this form basis of exercise, where you look at the price incentives and look at the cost, you can start being able to look at adoption dynamics and look at the grid outcomes as a result. So what we've earlier researched, there's a duck curve where if you've got PV, you put customers in, they'll dip it down, then your minimums occur. So that every year keeps dropping down, and you get a slight shaving at the end of the day. So that helps. The moment you pull in batteries and you economically incentivize them, you actually cause all those people who put smaller PV systems, because they weren't getting paid for a lot of the export, to upgrade. They're going to put a big in. The moment they do that, they actually have more export capability. And those batteries usually are not sized to absorb all the feed-in comes out. So that they end up charging up early morning, and they get full down here. And all that happens is this bottom gets bigger and bigger. So that problem doesn't go away. What you do get though is this drop down. So this minimum demand becomes an growing issue, and the late afternoon peaks drop. So you also end up having this thing being pretty sticky, and the morning it stays up higher, and you're suddenly starting a down ramp problem with your generator, where this down ramp is more severe than the ramps. So these sort of dynamics are playing out. And what's interesting is when you look at it across a year, so this is the consumption a year, summer peaks, then this is the green being where the minimum today is, purple being where the maximums are. If you add a small amount of PV, you sort of continue to consume normally would, export around there. But the moment you start putting more batteries in, you start having a much more winter dominant demand, lots of exports towards summer, and all your timing starts shifting. Now, all of these have real impacts in how the market will dispatch. How much PV you put in order to supply the rest of your system, given it's only a proportion of all of that. So this project is to look at how to quantify what other impacts can actually happen to the rest of on the generation side and utility scale for both utility PV, utility wind, and utility battery as well. So how did that actually get affected by households putting PVs and battery, and how do you quantify and then quantify those elements? So what we've done is we take the whole simulation model, we ramp it from 2019 to 2030, sort of have all these households investing, determining the profile of the net will look like for the households. Then we take that and get into the set of entire network. And this small subsection will then will feed into a dispatch investment model to figure out how much wind, coal generation, gas generation would you actually use to have the lowest cost system. So this whole thing was set out in the Swiss networks in Australia. Context, because I was there not long ago, but as an interesting case study, it's an islanded network. There's no export to anywhere else. Right now, there's about 28% of all households have solar PV, and they've got intervals in the last quarter where we're at 42% of the entire network was just solar PV. Now, that's expected to almost triple in 2030, and there's no export. That whole network, how do you export? So how do you qualify that? How do you understand where those repercussions actually lie? And households only make up 30% of consumption. So that one segment, how much influence can it actually have? So we built it all. So this is more for reference, and we took real household data and we interlaced with all the economic information, and then we grouped that in with residual network demand and ran that through a power system optimization model. So This is what I developed, was the landscape model to look at household electricity landscape, investment landscape, and Wolf brought his data model and then made it a way specific one. So we went through a number of those, and that is essentially the experimental setup. How do we get the minimum amount of steps so that we can evaluate that change? So we did a factual study, and we did that across multiple feed-in tariff values and multiple renewable energy share for about 500,000 households. So that 1,000 comes out of the most forecast number of installations in 2023 of PV. So in this situation, households' battery systems are effectively dumb. They own after themselves. They don't care anything whatsoever with the grid. They just go, I want to maximize my system for myself and reduce my electricity bills. So this is more for reference. Getting held underlying demand separated with PV is a very hard size to get publicly available information. We were able to get hands on to the data set from Ausgrid, which they've available for public use, and that came off gross energy meters, so you can actually see a separate PV curve with the household demand. We used that to approximate those 500,000 households. We know that that's ideal, but that's the best we could do. Then we took the cost projections based off Solar Choice does a lot of industry residential pricing as a baseline with cost projections by CSO and Schmidt, which is a worldwide rate curve. And took the retail projections, and we took operational demand same time period as Sydney. So just make sure it's the best that we could do in order to mix those two information together. Okay. Then we use conventional generation, wind, hydrogen, biomass, and that be black coal, open cycle gas turbine, and coal gas turbine. Then, so we took all that information and evaluated those feed-in tariffs. So the nation, we have a range around to about 56%. So 3 points as a check, and ran the model in order to figure out for each type of feed-in tariff what sort of systems get installed. Then using that, what is residual network demand? Do a counterfactual where there's no households whatsoever doing anything. Then comparing the whole lot in terms of results for optimized least cost system and checking the different renewable energy share. So we got 40% at 2030. That's being our current renewable energy target 2020 scaled down to 0% in 2050. And so what is that second at 2030? And bounded 10% up and down from that. So that became the experiment setup. And what we're really trying to do is go what would normally be installed, and then household PV batteries got installed. What's the difference? So first step is just to look at those households. And if the feed-in tariffs stay at 50%, then your actual self-consumption value and your feed-in, your export value are the same. There's actually very little to put PV. But what you find is everyone installs PV to the point where they can't install anymore, and there's and get any more feed-in. So they 5 kilowatt watts. Then if you drop the feed-in tariff to 2025, you get lots of people putting 5 kilowatt systems in, and all the high consumption households end up going, hey, it's actually cost effective for me to use the feed-in tariff. I don't want it because it's actually better if I upgrade my PV system, put the batteries in, and I'm still better off. So you'll have that occurring. And under 0% tariff, you end up having more of a spread where you have smaller PV because you don't get paid as much for any feed-in, but have a much bigger battery. So these three sort of scenarios just spin out. And we want to see how does that really influence that small segment of households, that 50% of the network. How does that relate to actual incentives, and how much can it change how much PV and wind you actually put in the system? So first step is the capacity side. And so we run model analysis and go, if there was no household PV and battery systems, we assume no one will put anything in, and stays the same at 2030. Then with, this is a 39% renewable energy, 49, 59%, then you become quite dependent on your wind and your solar to meet your renewable energy share. Isn't too surprising. And as you require more renewable energy, then you actually install more battery systems. And this is utility battery. Okay, so once you put under the 50%, where you've got lots of PV effectively installed, then what you end up seeing is, so this one's being how much you actually capacity installed for both the power side and the energy for batteries. That's the difference. And what you find is wind drops, wind drops, solar drops, utility solar drops. You displace that. You've knocked them out of the market just by virtue of your source of renewable energy, and they don't produce as much. So you've got that. The interesting factor is, as your renewable energy increases, utility DP is more and more disadvantaged, whereas wind actually starts to recover. So wind becomes a fact that is more, or it's less affected by household PVs and batteries than other utility PV, by obvious reasons that it uses at the same time. And you also get an interesting effect where, with all that extra PV from households, you end up getting more utility batteries in order to take advantage of all of that. Okay, so the moment that you start adding batteries and trees into this, then the utility batteries start to change the story, where previously with all that extra PV, you'd be like, I need to put some utility battery installations in to make use of that. That starts to play. That whole justification becomes to erode. And even though all these households have all this additional battery capacity on the network that's running themselves, the network sees it pretty officially as well. There's no benefit. It doesn't help the network one way, it doesn't really benefit the network the other way. There's very little change in the amount of utility battery capacity that you end up installing. On top of that, so displacement of wind and solar PV still occurs in a similar arrangement where both are affected, wind less so. Then if we go to the theory scenario where there's even household battery storage on the mix, then something interesting happens. Then a displacement that occurs with wind and solar starts to decrease, because they're able to utilize more of the demand. There's less of an effect on the network, and there's more scope for utility PV wind to play a role. So that's on the capacity dimension. Then look at the generation and then the actual energy amount, the nameplate capacity of a PV farm, but generation that it produces. Find wind is always your dominant source of energy. So renewable energy, wind is your main player. So, and it does more renewable energy share that you need. So there's this incentive or winds to be shielded from, it offers at a lower cost form of generation. Okay. Then, because the model is constrained, where whatever the renewable energy share is, you need to displace a conventional, then coal is the biggest loser for obvious reasons. And OCGT and CCGT are generally unaffected. So the interesting thing is, so looking at generation, this is all the results there, because everything I said about capacity is effectively replicated in that picture. The takeaway here is, with household PV, with PVs and batteries, there's a bump in coal, and partially driven by this guy here, which is the increase of battery in the network, either utility or households. So there is a sort of a rebound effect that occurs slightly with the amount of storage they put on the network. So there is it creates a space where there's a smoothing of the network, and coal can actually enter that. It's sort of a ramping issue. And so there's some element to be aware of as batteries are actually entering the network. So the end of the justification and the explanation of how that actually occurs, we have a whole bunch of slides at the end, but for the interest of time, we'll plot it on. Okay, so the next part is when, this is an interesting effect, and it really, because we can link these models together, we can actually find these analyses, is if you look at household demand, commercial demand, and you look at the wholesale price across the year. So this is average. Every interval, I'll just take average price. I'll take the average demand and I'll plot. So that gives you a way to say households pay a lot, or the cost of supplying energy to households during this peak is actually high, because you multiply by that price how much they consume, and that's sort of the average, the cost to supply those customers across the world. It's interesting what happens when you start adding precision to things. So under the 500,000 prosumage households, 500,000 non-prosumage households, and the commercial demand is the same. What happens to wholesale price? Like, how does that change the cost of supplying these market segments? And yes, it does. So because these prosumage households don't need as much time during the end of the day, then that peak diminishes, and benefits other households. So the other households who demand more during that peak no longer costs as much in order to supply them that energy, and they don't need as much during the morning up and down, so they're less affected. So overall, great normal prosumages, and prosumage households benefit because they also less energy for the cost of energy over here. But the actual everyone else benefits more because for their profile and for those cost intersections, they pay even, or they cost lesser supply. So the net effect is everyone else, being commercial and industrial, will also have a slight increase. So there's this potential dynamic at play on how these time curves intersect with the cost over time. Then on the other side of the equation is how much would it actually cost if you added up all the utility scale generation, utility scale storage. You add in all the PVs that get installed, all the batteries get installed, and not surprisingly, it costs more when people do it themselves. They pay a premium for the actual equipment, and on top of that, so this is where there's lots of PV with the batteries, PV with a lot of batteries, is additional value or costs that all these households pay battery systems don't save much for the network. The network still has to their own systems in. It doesn't help reduce the amount of utility battery that's required on the system. So there's actually quite an increased jump of systems as a result of that. So this means that there's avenue to do better. Why should everyone pay more when you could run the system efficiently? And half of that equation is really how people rate those batteries. These batteries are right now only thinking for themselves. They're not trying to help the network. They're not trying to reduce any costs that are borne by a utility supply. So that effectively wraps up the whole paper and that whole process, where we found utility PV only substituted much more by household PV companies, and wind power is affected. So that's more resilient under these operating scenarios to have a presence dominance on the network. Then utility capacities, when household batteries come in, you still need them. You seem to escape out of them. And there's a slight decrease in wholesale prices faced by non-prosumage households. So the households stand to have a less cost. So hopefully they'll surpass that saving on back to them. Now, all of this on the premise that the household battery operation doesn't try anything else, doesn't do anything else. So it actually calls into an opportunity effectively to capitalize upon it. This lot of spare capacity that's not used throughout the year, especially in the winter month, that could be used for the rest of the grid for its benefit. So I guess that brings my entire presentation to a close. Do I go into the next seminars, or shall we be there for questions?
Yes.
First, I would like to say thank you, Kelvin. Give him a hand. On it, very good. With hats on, but no, it's very nice. This work we've been doing together for quite a while, being wrapped up in such a nice way. So good job. Thank you very much. So I think we would take a couple of questions here and then look if some online people also want to ask a question. So please.
Yes. I'm using demand-side responsibility to Are you using demand-side response to possibility, well, intelligent demand-side response to possibility to reduce the impact of coal, and then obviously push into this this opportunity that you're speaking of as well?
So demand-side response, interesting, is if it does anything to smooth out network, it actually helps coal. And then that sort of has an implication for, should there be a carbon tax to remove that incentive? From a system operation overall cost, demand response makes use of your entire assets more efficiently, and households get that capacity to do so. Thank you.
Other questions? May I ask you to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks. Dylan from the Climate and Energy College. Just got a question about, I guess, how you've considered rate classes. As I understand it, you've used 29 cents and a 4% per year. Have you looked at? I mean, basically, we're coming from is the tariffs are largely an artificial construct, and there's no reason that they should do that, and they don't actually reflect the underlying costs. I guess I'd be interested to know how your results are, how robust they are to changes in tariff structure, and that point you've actually got for the decrease in wholesale prices. I guess I would challenge or argue that based on current tariff design, that would actually you would actually have an increase in rate price tariffs for prosumer households based on current arrangements. It's be interesting to hear a bit of a discussion about that component of your work.
Yes, so we chose the plus 4% on there, knowing that it doesn't take into consideration a lot of the expectations for price reduction with the renewable energy penetration or marginal cost suggestion. Those prices should drop. By the time, how that story has been going on, and another picture of what is the network charge and that component, which is 5% of your electricity bill. How much would that influence those overall price? Would that cancel out to them make better or worse? So it was more to have a position, and then we've evaluated the prices increase and decrease and around them, and found is this sort of tipping point that occurs with household PVs and batteries is driven also by the reductions in those installation costs, and that if the electricity price didn't increase as previously, all it did is push away that tipping point for PV adoption by a couple of years. require electricity price to be slightly higher and by a certain amount before you actually invest. And given that these are cheaper, you can actually find a better cost official to install. So there's this sort of leeway between a transition point, and all you're doing is playing with when then that transition occurs. And the robustness comes out of as long as we expect PV panel prices to keep on reducing, as long as battery price on reducing, then we're sort of faced this eventuality being presented itself. Yes.
May I probably with my other hat on may I add to that? So I think the question was excellent, and it was so pointing in one direction. So that leads to the general setup of analysis, as we have soft linked these two models with one of the prime exogenous input assumptions on the PV battery simulation side is the tariff price increase, and on the other model, one of the outputs is then actually the wholesale price impact. And so this is a consequence of our setup, but I think for future research, it would then also be very interesting to try to further integrate the two, and then see what would be then again the retail price of these wholesale price impacts. Although there's obviously a layer of other things happening there, lots of additional assumptions to be made. Maybe before we have again a bit of a gender balance would be fantastic. So we can.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the Marcy Faith from G. I'm just wondering if you've been keeping track of what's happening in South Australia with the disconnection from the grid, because it's got some similarities with Western Australia. There's been some significantly, a lot of curtailment of wind as well as solar, and so how do you think that looking at that with your results, how do you feel about kind of that? You're saying that wind actually has no effect, but in reality, South Australia is seeing quite a significant amount of curtailment.
Under that operating scenario, where once it's islanded, it needs synchronous generation to be running, it's natural that the whole system as it stands was already over capacity in terms of wind. And that comment and becomes an operation duration once that situation occurs. Once the island is removed, then that releases itself. But having said that, what we've seen has been a great use of both utility batteries and the power plants in South Australia in order to stabilize that whole situation. So this capacity that comes on by households just looking after themselves becomes this untapped potential of use for the rest of the system, given the right incentives to contribute to these sort of system events. And I want to see these happening. I think there's a selfishness involved, but there's also untapped potential that given other people's investment, their money, if you bridge that gap, you now have access to all these resources that may be actually a lot cheaper than putting a utility system in or putting additional generation in.
We have more questions. Oh, sorry. Rebecca.
Moderator and mic runner. Thank you, Kelvin. That was great. I'm Rebecca, Energy Transitions Hub as well. My question is a follow-on from what you were just talking about. The third bullet point talks about how you don't see utility battery being substituted when you have household batteries being optimized for the person who's made the investment. Have you looked at how that changes if you have these sort of virtual power plants making use of the household batteries, or is that just an area for?
That's an area of future research that I'd love to get into. Yeah. Is to build this analysis and quantify. And what I'm really interested in is quantify what is that potential, and is it worth investing time, effort, businesses around actually building up that case? And it's sort of highlighting, yes, there is quite a lot of overcapacity that becomes available. And how to make it optimal and how to actually integrate all of that within the market mechanisms, really interesting space that I'm trying to move into.
I think that should be our next after the next paper. But just a bit of an insight from other countries, for example, Germany. So we've said there that we see something changes when batteries can do more and are available for further market interactions. But it then still depends on the overall size of the battery relative that is induced by prosumage relative to what would be the optimal storage capacity on the net. And if it's still too large, then you get this inefficiency from a system or power sector perspective as well.
So what you found, what would you recommend the Western Australian government do, or maybe recommend that they do?
Is that feed-in tariff need change in both the temporal nature. It needs to value the generation over time, and when you create the vehicle or some form of virtual power plant arrangement with the retail space. And there isn't one, because in the Western Australian space, there is only one retailer. And currently they're not really interested in that space. And on top of that, ideally from an economic, we need cost reflective tariffs, the price needs to be exposed to customers, but then from social implication, that doesn't seem fair either. And there's a lot of socioeconomic disparities that occur because of that. So this sort of just tries to create this space to understand where some of these distinctions lie to have a greater discussion. There's no clear or simple answer to how the tariffs change. There is capability and an asset that's now sort of available, or potentially available, and it comes down to that innovative drive, find a way to release that.
Thanks. Are you engaged with the Western Australian government? Have you shown them your results, or are you planning to?
I've shown them the change in grid utilization results and the expectation of additional PV on the back of more batteries, and they've been interested in that. However, the institutional issues mean that just things take time.
And we have another question here. Thank you. Oh, sorry, we forgot Dylan. You wanted. Sorry.
Chang from the Energy Transition Hub as well. Interesting study. I'm just wondering, you put all the transmission constraints and distribution constraints there, how the final generation mix will be affected?
I would love to do that, but the purpose of this was to look from what are the qualitative sort of outcomes that come from household PV battery prosumage, and the moment we start adding the whole network constraints, the moment we start adding the particular topologies, then the whole analysis becomes very focused on a particular location that is less just generalizable, and it comes down to just seeing how do households invest in the system themselves, where they themselves don't care about the grid, and how everyone is forced to react. By no doubt, there'll be network constraint issues with too much PV feeding. How the network is utilized becomes less efficient, and these all need to be, network expansion, money needs to be provided, and that equation and how that occurs is currently outside of space, this piece of research, but yes, it is a direction them to go.
So let's have Dylan again, and you.
Yeah, thanks. Just back on the tariff question again. I just wanted to point out that there's actually, I guess, quite significant economic consequences of what you're currently proposing or you're currently modeling. There's embedded assumptions around fairness, those, and I guess fairness is much in the eye of the beholder. Back to my original question, and I take your point about introductions changing the point in time, your crossover curve. I guess I'm thinking more about like structure changes to how we pay for electricity. So, for example, 29 cent kilowatt hour, 15 networks, say, if that moves to say 15 cents a kilowatt hour volumetric and $5 a year, $1,000 a year as a fixed kVA charge or something like that, I suspect that would have very profound impacts on consumers, but also your results. It'd be interested to hear your reflections on that.
Yes. So that was an interesting dynamic in that anything you do with a volumetric changes how much PV and how much batteries that you install. It's a cost avoidance metric. Anything you do to the daily charge, the static stage, has no effect. So if you're a retailer trying to find out how do I increase my revenue, then they may increasingly favor the charge over the volumetric charge because of the implications that it has for households in their own system. And that by itself also has the socioeconomic question of fairness of should people who use less energy end up paying more. So these structural implications have this very, very interesting to-ing, fro-ing, and it all leads to this very, very constrained set of operating conditions that the retailers can operate within, the whole system can operate within, where how do they recoup their costs and what is actually fair? It's more the modeling exercise of being able to case what directions are available and why they in one direction over the next, but determining which is one to go next is a very open question.
Can I add 2 sentences? So it's good that you pointed out that this is an assumption that the actual retail tariff doesn't change. And obviously, if it does, going towards more capacity-oriented tariffs, for example, and less energy or volumetric based, then obviously things change. And also the interrelation then with the feed tariff. So the incentive go either for pure consumption only PV or with battery or for pure feed-in on the very tariff design. And I cannot help myself just to promote a bit of complementary hub research we're doing for the German side, where we explore actually just that. And you see how much do you have to go for capacity oriented or flat lump sum based tariffs until your incentives to go self-consumption actually break down. That's explored somewhere else. So then we had another hand over there, here, and then maybe want to go first?
Hi, thank you. Really interesting presentation. I'm Stephen, also from college here. So your modelling looks at households as being primarily kind of rational economic actors. You let a disinterest in the wider grid and a real interest in sort of household budgets and economics. But presumably other factors also play into households' decisions around energy consumption, solar panels and batteries. And those other kinds of attachment, social solidarity or environmental goodwills or sort of leanings towards collective action entered into your research frame, or could they possibly in the future?
That was a direction that I wanted to move this modeling exercise. So I designed the actual model initially to lead to some of those incorporations in, and so that avenue is actually available. But in terms of in the stage of the research, it hasn't been incorporated in. Interesting point. What interesting finding was, if I look at the current WAtions and I look at the retail conditions, people really only be putting a 1.75 kilowatt system. But in actual fact, they're putting 5-6 kilowatt systems in. So they're actually not economically rational and being exceedingly, they're over seeing the amount of PV. So that starts to question in terms of who can afford it, what are their actual rationales and intentions of these processes, and maybe these can being trigger empirical data that you can feed into the actual model. And I want to explore that further.
Okay, we have so many. Maybe you go for you first, then you again, and then you. So maybe you can ask like really short questions, try to answer shortly, and I would say anything else.
Alec from Synergy Politica. We're the modelling thing over an interesting period of time with regards to EV adoption, potential of that having a pretty significant impact from a demand and also a VT perspective. Something that's not been factored into this model?
Correct. And then that comes down to where are my bounds of certainty in order to actually have an exercise that I can solidly have a conclusion, be it driving profile, cars are installed, spare capacity is actually available, the technology available, and the ability to forecast, perfect foresight or bounded foresight, that all playing a role. How much PVs will actually impact the underlying demand? Yes, it rise. When it will rise depends how you charge, and all the questions are ideal that I'd like to explore in at a later date when that information starts coming.
I'd love to say something about electric vehicles, but I don't. So,
hi, Kevin Patterson, former energy analyst for New Zealand government. I found your talk very interesting, particularly from an isolated network point of view. I'm a little troubled as to where you see a tipping point and what that impact is. From my point of view, I see a tipping point being when you have so much P on the system that we've got a mix model at the moment where you're looking at a combination of retail price, sale price, and a line charge price. But the reality is, when you're out there in the market, initial market, you're really only looking at electricity generation costs, even in West Australia, in the order of less than 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's where you're going to be drifting to, I believe, in the long term. And you're seeing effects of with the 5 kilowatt capacity that you have. So the commercial markets, it's attempting to put a cap on that.
Yes.
How do you see that playing out in the long term? Do you actually see a future for large and households, or do you see it shifting really to a network PV situation?
I think that the utilities have yet to find a compelling argument if electricity prices need to increase, people to continue being dependent upon it. So, and that call into question, this whole exercise was just to go, if you let things be business as usual, you choose not to re-engage with your customer and actually say, here's a service that is providing. I'm actually pass these things on to you so that you don't have to, you feel content to be part of the network. It doesn't happen. Households have a lot more power to control how they consume and what they end up using from the network. And that boundary of where the energy meter sits and where those asks go becomes a really strong bargaining position from the house that seems to be at times underrepresented, yet empirically the amount of adoption that's occurring is also on expectations each year. So it becomes a question of where is that compromise in order to figure out how do you actually people on the network can continue to use it for the service that they want to pay for. And from my perspective is I'd actually that compromise to occur. There's a lot of inefficiency having all these household systems just looking after themselves, and everyone has to look after themselves as well. So it strikes the question of how do you actually reset these tariff arrangements and the propositions given to those customers so that they're part of the solution and actually back onto the work in order to provide the energy. Because overall, ability to provide an energy at an ideal is still cheaper than in households.
So we have 3 minutes left and two questions. And so I would ask you again to try to be short in asking and answering.
Hi, my name's David. I'm with Redback Technology. I'm interested, just a simple question in side. What was your criteria in relation to household batteries and utility batteries timeline you're talking about 2030?
The 2030 household batteries were sized in order to minimize their electricity bills. So whatever the profile was, they determined, given the forward estimates of how much it would cost for the electricity, would give me the bill saving. And that comes off the assumption that their consumption profiles will stay similar year on year. So approximately, I think like a 5 kilowatt system actually quite a lot of energy, and the amount of and then it comes down to be it a 4 or 8 or a 12 kilowatt hour system will actually give you quite a large amount of your energy supply across the year. And a lot of the residential system are already around that range. So I can see that we're getting close to that sweet spot of what size it should be.
Okay, and the final question.
I'll make it nice and quick. So you focused on some residential.
Yes.
With CNI, obviously they've
Yes.
started to move to solar in CNI. They're much more fractional actors, similar to what the gentleman there was saying. So is that something that you're going to look at doing, or just can you reuse your model?
Well, the CI side, from the modeling and a research perspective, getting access to everyone's electricity bill, what the demand charges are, in order to do that modeling exercise, it's a very, unfortunately, difficult arrangement. But because demand charges are so high with CNI, there's also cases there just putting trees so they don't have to be exposed to those demand charges without any PV is cost effective. And at the same time, seeing, especially in the WA case, the biggest growth now is not households. The biggest growth factor is commercial. And Australia's going to go forth, and the whole commercial space is going to take off. And these sort of household expectation, this sort of studies are magnified because all of this still sits behind the meter. We can't seem to escape from it because households have that, or customers have their own that we're working toward.
Okay, so let me thank you all these very insightful questions and for the great talk. So obviously, I think this was fantastic research. So thanks again, Kelvin. 2 more things to say. That is the coming seminar. So you can find all the dates and everything on the website. And there was an online question: will the slides be available? I think not only the slides, but also especially this whole great talk. So you can see Kelvin again on the YouTube channel, and the Climate and Energy College people will again put it on, right? So that's, and thank you very much for coming.